Picture two raised beds in the same backyard a few steps apart. Same soil mix, same tomatoes, same afternoon. One gardener finishes 40 minutes of work tired in the legs and pleased with herself. The other finishes the same 40 minutes and loses the evening to a heating pad and a bag of frozen peas. The plants are identical. The soil is identical. The entire difference between those two afternoons is a span of inches in the wooden frame. One bed stands 11 inches off the ground. The other stands 30. At 11 inches, an adult working the edge has to fold forward from the hips and stay folded for most of the session. At 30, that same adult stands close to upright and reaches down with the arms. Two postures produced by two heights, sustained for the same amount of time. And forward folding is not a small thing for a lower back. In 1999, a team led by Hans-Joachim Wilke published a study in the journal Spine in which a pressure sensor about 1.5 millimeters across was implanted directly into a lumbar disc of a healthy volunteer and read while he went about ordinary activities. Relaxed standing measured around 0.5 megapascal inside that disc. Standing bent forward measured around 1 1/10. The load roughly doubled just from the angle of the torso. One volunteer, one disc, so read it with all the caution a single case deserves, though it agreed with the older measurements it was built to check, and it agrees with plain leverage. Your upper body is a weight on the end of a lever. Move it forward of your hips and the muscles along your spine have to pull harder to hold it there, while the joints underneath absorb the difference. So the obvious conclusion is to build tall. 30 inches. Maybe 36. Done. Except that is exactly the mistake, running in the opposite direction. There is no universal correct raised bed height. There is a correct method for finding yours, and almost every published bed plan skips it entirely because those plans are organized around lumber. Bodies come later. Consider how the standard sequence goes. Somebody decides to build a bed. They look at boards. A 2x12 is the widest common dimensional board, and despite the name, it measures 11 1/4 inches. One board tall gives you an 11-inch bed. Two stacked gives you 22 1/2. Cedar fence pickets give you something else again. Then the plan gets drawn, the corners get squared, a small fortune in soil goes in, and only on the first real working day does the gardener discover what posture that height will force on them for the life of the bed. Notice the order: material, plan, build, and only then posture, arriving last and by accident. The heights that dominate backyard gardening are artifacts of a sawmill, and a sawmill has never met your spine. Turn the order around and everything downstream changes. Posture sets the reference height sets the soil volume sets the weight, the cost, the outward pressure on the boards, and the watering schedule. 4 real constraints, all of them downstream of a decision most people never consciously make. Before any of that, it helps to know what angle you are trying to avoid, because bending over is too vague to build with. There is an international ergonomic standard, ISO 11226, that evaluates static working postures. Its trunk table is refreshingly blunt. Trunk inclination under 20 degrees from vertical is simply acceptable. Between 20 and 60 degrees, the posture is not automatically condemned, but it has to be evaluated against how long you hold it, and it becomes acceptable when the trunk is fully supported. Beyond 60 degrees, the standard lists it as not recommended, full stop. Washington State's Department of Labor and Industries publishes a hazard checklist for exactly this kind of thing. Working with a back bent forward more than 30 degrees, without support and without the ability to change posture for more than 4 hours in a day, gets flagged. Bend past 45 degrees and the flag drops to 2 hours. Those thresholds were written for warehouses and assembly lines, and they translate uncomfortably well to a Saturday spent transplanting seedlings at ankle height. What keeps those numbers from being merely depressing is that duration is half the criterion. A single bend costs you nothing. 40 unbroken minutes at 45 degrees is another animal. And that word supported is doing real work, because full trunk support explicitly includes indirect support, such as resting your arms on the workplace itself. Hold that thought. It becomes the cheapest fix in this subject. Now the classification, because the derivation branches immediately. First question: which posture will you actually hold for 40 minutes? Not the one you admire, the one you will really adopt. Standing at the edge, perching on a stool or a bucket, or seated in a chair or a wheelchair for the whole session. These are not points on a scale. A bed built for a seated gardener is unworkable standing, and one built for a standing gardener is out of reach seated. Second question, which joint is the limiting one, back or knees? If the back is the constraint, your enemy is sustained trunk flexion, and height is your main lever. If the knees are, your enemy is kneeling and squatting, and that same Washington checklist flags each of those beyond 4 hours as its own risk factor. A knee-limited gardener gets an enormous return from almost any height that ends the kneeling, while a back-limited gardener can kneel at a low bed all afternoon and feel perfectly fine. Third question, where are you in the build? Still planning, boards already bought, or already built and full of soil? Each has a different set of moves, and the last has more options than people assume. Two prerequisites have to be settled before any number because both can override the answer you are about to reach. The first is what sits underneath. On open ground, the height of the frame and the depth of the root zone are separate questions because roots do not stop at the bottom board. University of Georgia Extension guidance puts the working minimum at about 10 inches of soil for most garden crops. And on open ground, a 10-inch frame delivers that plus whatever the native soil contributes. On concrete, a patio, or a deck, those two numbers collapse into one. Whatever depth you build is the entire root zone, permanently. That same Georgia guidance notes that on a hard surface, 10 inches may not be enough for crops like potatoes, which raises the question of what crops actually need. And the answer is less than most people assume, though not uniformly. Extension irrigation guidance groups vegetables by rooting habit. Shallow crops such as lettuce and bunching onions keep most of their roots in the top 6 to 12 inches, while deep feeders such as tomatoes and asparagus work the top 2 to 4 feet when the soil lets them. On open ground, that spread costs you nothing. Over concrete, that spread is your budget. The second prerequisite is what height costs you, and this is where enthusiasm meets arithmetic. Take a bed with 32 square feet of surface, filled 12 inches deep, that is 32 cubic feet of soil, roughly 1 2/10 cubic yards. Raise it to 30 inches, and you are at 80 cubic feet, just under 3 cubic yards. 2.5 times the material before you have planted anything. Then the weight. The Natural Resources Conservation Service treats a bulk density around 1 and 1/3 grams per cubic centimeter as close to ideal for plant growth, which works out to roughly 83 pounds per cubic foot dry. Wet it down, and 100 pounds per cubic foot is a fair planning figure. That 30-inch bed is carrying something near 8,000 pounds. 4 tons. Worth saying out loud before anyone builds a tall bed on a deck, a balcony, or anything else with a load rating they haven't checked. And then the pressure, which is the part that actually breaks beds. Soil pushes sideways as well as down, and the sideways push grows with depth. The International Building Code's starting figure for loose sand and gravel backfill is 30 pounds per square foot for every foot of depth. Higher for silty or clay material. Because that pressure builds all the way down, the total outward force on a wall grows with the square of its height. A 1-foot wall carries about 15 pounds of push per running foot. 2 feet carries 60. 3 feet carries 135. Tripling the height multiplies the push by 9. Translate that to a real bed. A 30-inch wall, 8 feet long, holds back something like 750 pounds of outward force on that one side, permanently through freeze, thaw, and every soaking rain. That is why a tall bed needs cross ties across the span, or thicker stock, or corner posts sunk into the ground, and why the same corner screws that hold a 12-inch bed together for a decade will let a 30-inch bed bow into a barrel in 2 seasons. The checkpoint for that is easy and worth doing every spring. Crouch at one end and sight straight down the longboard. A hairline of curve is normal. More than about half an inch of belly at midspan means the joint is losing and a cross tie goes in before you refill. With all of that on the table, the number itself. Start by measuring the reference height for the posture you chose. For a standing gardener, that is elbow height. Stand relaxed on the surface you will really stand on, not a slope, in the shoes you garden in. Let the upper arms hang, bend the forearms to level, and have somebody measure from the ground to the underside of the elbow. With nobody to hold the tape, the kitchen gives a usable proxy. A standard American counter runs 36 inches, and where that edge lands against your elbow tells you most of what you need. Then apply the offset. The Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety publishes work surface guidance for standing tasks, and it separates them by force. Precision work wants the surface about 2 inches above elbow height with the elbows supported. Light work wants it 2 to 4 inches below the elbow. Heavy work with real downward force wants it 8 to 16 inches below. Gardening straddles those categories. Most of the minutes in a bed go to transplanting, thinning, weeding, pinching, and picking, all light. A much smaller share goes to turning soil and driving a spade, which is heavy. Design for the majority and accept the exception, because the exception is short and you can step to a lower bed or a ground row for it. One more correction keeps this from being a bench calculation. Your hands spend most of their time below the soil surface. Setting a seedling puts your fingers 3 or 4 inches down, weeding an inch or two, harvesting greens right at the top. The plane you operate on sits under the soil line, so the soil line has to sit higher than a workbench would to compensate. Put it together, and the practical rule is this. For a standing gardener, the soil surface wants to sit within about a hand's width below your standing elbow height. For most American adults, that lands somewhere between 30 and 36 inches, which is not a coincidence. It is why Ohio AgriBility's Universal Design Guidance recommends beds of 2.5 to 3 feet, and why the Georgia Extension Guidance names 36 inches as the height that keeps you from bending excessively. Those recommendations are the derivation's answer for an average body, and there's no reason yours should be average. 2 cheap checkpoints tell you whether you got it right. Before building, stack crates to your candidate height, set a tub of damp soil on top, and work it for 10 honest minutes. If your chin drops and your shoulders round forward, you are low, have someone at your side call it, because shoulders drifting past your toes is the 20-degree line going by. After building, run the 40-minute test, legs tired as a pass. A band of ache across the lower back is the bed telling you the number's wrong. Now the branches, because that rule was written for one body and one posture. If you garden seated, particularly from a wheelchair, the arithmetic changes completely and the popular advice becomes misleading. 24 inches gets quoted everywhere as the wheelchair height. That figure assumes you pull alongside the bed and work sideways, which is useful and limited at the same time, because working sideways trades a lean for a twist. Rolling your knees under the planting surface and facing your work squarely is a different specification, and the accessibility standards spell it out. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act standards, the space between 9 and 27 inches above the ground counts as knee clearance, and it must run at least 11 inches deep at 9 inches up and 8 inches deep at 27 inches up. Work surface tops run 28 inches minimum to 34 maximum. Read those together, and a hard limit appears. The underside of the planting box has to clear 27 inches. The top should not exceed 34, and that leaves roughly 6 or 7 inches for the soil box itself. A soil-filled bed cannot do this. Only an elevated planter on open legs can, and geometry sets its soil depth for you. Hear the consequence before you build one. North Carolina State Extension Guidance on Garden Tables notes that while boxes can be as shallow as 3 inches, 4 to 6 or more is preferred, because deeper soil reduces watering and gives roots somewhere to go. 6 inches of mix held above the ground with air on all sides dries faster than anything else in the garden. Excellent for lettuce, spinach, herbs, and bunching onions. Poor for tomatoes and genuinely bad for potatoes. One more seated figure worth carrying. Those same standards cap a high forward reach at 48 inches, dropping to 44 once you are reaching over something more than 20 inches deep. A planting surface above that line is simply unreachable. If you plan to perch on a stool or a garden seat, the method holds, but the measurement moves. Sit on the stool you will actually use on the actual ground, and measure ground to elbow from there, then apply the same offset. Perching height and standing height usually land 5 to 10 inches apart, and a bed split between them serves neither well. The branch decision here runs one way only. If you will sometimes stand and sometimes perch, build for the standing number and buy a taller stool. You can raise a body cheaply. Raising 3 cubic yards of soil is a weekend and a delivery fee. If your knees are the limiting joint rather than your back, relax about the perfect number. Your win comes from ending the kneeling and squatting, and almost any working height above knee level delivers it. 24 inches will transform your sessions. Watch the leaning, though, because knee-limited gardeners tend to brace against the frame. That is where a flat cap board on the walls earns its cost. A forearm on a rail is exactly the indirect trunk support the standard treats as changing the posture's category. Which brings us to the commonest case of all. The bed is already built, already full, and rebuilding it is not happening. 3 moves in order of effort. The first is a collar. Add 1 more course of boards on top of the existing frame and top up the soil. 2 conditions come attached. Fasten the new course into interior corner posts or into blocking, never into the end grain of the old boards, because end grain will not hold screws under sustained outward pressure. And once the total wall passes about 2 feet, put cross ties across the span, since the outward push has quadrupled by then. Before adding anything, push a screwdriver into the base of each corner post. If it sinks into soft wood, that frame's finished and a collar is the wrong project. The second costs almost nothing. Cap the walls with a flat rail wide enough to rest a forearm on. The soil stays exactly where it was, and the lean becomes a supported one, which is the distinction sitting in the middle of the International Standards trunk table. The third move needs no tools. Reassign crops by how often you touch them. Garlic, potatoes, and winter squash get handled a handful of times between planting and harvest. Lettuce, herbs, beans, and anything you pick weekly get handled constantly. Put the high-contact crops on the highest surface you own and leave the low bed to the crops that ask for nothing. The height stays what it is. What drops is the number of hours you spend bent over it, and duration is half of every threshold in this subject. Oh, if none of that is possible, the last lever is the clock. Under 20 degrees of lean, hold it as long as you like. Past that, the standards start counting minutes. Break the session into blocks, alternate tasks that use different postures, and stop treating a 4-hour Saturday as one unit. A watering consequence rides along with all of this, and it deserves saying before you commit. The taller the bed, the more it behaves like a container. Utah State Extension guidance notes that raised soil warms faster and that higher soil temperatures increase evaporative loss, meaning more frequent irrigation through summer. A tall bed with a small footprint has more of its soil near a wall and more of its volume above the cooling influence of the ground. Height buys your back real relief and charges you in water. Sow the order cleanly for the next real thing you do. Decide the posture you will hold for 40 minutes. Identify whether your back or your knees is the limiting joint. Check what is under the bed because open ground and concrete lead to different depths. Measure your elbow height in that posture in your garden shoes. Set the soil surface within a hand's width below it and mock it up with crates for 10 minutes before buying a board. Then test that number against what you can carry. The cubic yards, the 4 tons, the outward push that grows with the square of the height, the cross ties past 2 feet. If cost or structure forces you lower, go as high as you can brace and cap the rail so your forearms carry some of what is left. If you work seated with a forward approach, skip the soil-filled bed and build the elevated planter with its underside above 27 inches and its top below 34, then plant it with things that tolerate a shallow, thirsty root zone. Come back now to those 2 beds at the start. They were never really competing on inches. One was designed by a lumber mill and the other by a gardener who decided how she wanted to stand before she decided what to buy. The inches were the symptom. The order of the decisions was the cause. And a bed built in the right order can still be the wrong height for somebody else, which is the whole point. None of this makes gardening effortless, and anyone promising that is selling something. A well-derived bed still leaves you tired. It leaves you tired in the legs and shoulders instead of in the one joint that takes weeks to forgive you. If this changed the number in your head, take the elbow measurement today before the lumber run and put your figure in the comments next to your height. Those pairs stacking up would be genuinely useful because the spread between the tall gardeners and the short ones is exactly what the standard plans pretend does not exist. And if you would rather not do this arithmetic twice, a like and a subscribe keeps it findable when the boards go on sale.